The rain never stops in Chicago when your world is ending. Michael Thompson had delivered thousands of meals to strangers who never looked him in the eye, never asked his name, never wondered if the man behind their door was drowning in bills and broken dreams. He was invisible, another working ghost in a city full of people too busy to notice the desperate. But tonight was different. Tonight, the woman who opened the penthouse door looked at him like he mattered. She tipped him more money than he made in a week, spoke to him like he was human, and invited him into a world of marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched toward heaven. What Michael didn't know was that she was the most wanted woman in America. $2 billion had vanished, and the FBI had been hunting her for 3 years. What she didn't know was that trusting a stranger with her secret would either save her life or destroy them both. Some deliveries change everything. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and some storms wash away more than just the rain. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the Chicago sleet, their rhythmic scraping barely keeping pace with the storm that had rolled in from Lake Michigan like an angry fist. Michael Thompson squinted through the blur, his knuckles white against the steering wheel of his 15-year-old Honda Civic. The heater wheezed out lukewarm air that smelled faintly of antifreeze. And somewhere in the dashboard, a warning light blinked orange, another problem he couldn't afford to fix. "Come on, girl," he muttered to the car, patting the cracked vinyl dashboard like an old friend. Just a few more deliveries. The bag of Thai food in the passenger seat had gone from steaming to merely warm 20 minutes ago. But Mike pressed on. Hungry customers meant tips, and tips meant Emma's violin lessons next month. The private school tuition was already stretching him thin, but he'd work himself into the ground before he'd let his 12-year-old daughter settle for less than she deserved. His phone buzzed in the mount, displaying the next address, Millennium Tower, Penthouse 47A, the kind of address that made his stomach clench with anxiety. Rich people had expectations, and men like him, guys with grease under their fingernails and second-hand jackets, didn't always meet them. 20 minutes later, Mike stood in the marble lobby of Millennium Tower, feeling every stain on his delivery uniform. The doorman, pressed and polished in a navy coat with gold buttons, looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Delivery for Ms. Stone," Mike said, holding up the thermal bag. "Penthouse elevator to your right," the doorman replied, his tone suggesting Mike should already know such things. The elevator rose smoothly, silently, carrying him past floors of wealth he could barely imagine. Floor 30, 35, 40. Each number felt like a reminder of how far he was from his own one-bedroom apartment, where Emma was probably finishing her homework at their second-hand kitchen table. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a hallway that looked more like a luxury hotel than an apartment building. Soft lighting, original artwork, carpet so thick it muffled his footsteps. At the end of the hall stood a single door, heavy and imposing. Mike knocked twice and waited. The door opened slowly, as if the person behind it was cautious, unsure. When it finally swung wide, Mike found himself looking at a woman who didn't fit his expectations of a penthouse dweller. She was perhaps 50, maybe a little older, with auburn hair that fell in soft waves past her shoulders. No makeup, wearing an oversized cream sweater that hung loosely over dark jeans. Barefoot, beautiful in an understated way that spoke of confidence rather than effort. But her eyes, dark brown and impossibly tired, held something Mike recognized. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying weight no one else could see. "Ms. Stone?" he asked. "Victoria," she said softly, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent he couldn't place. "And you must be Michael. I saw your name on the app." Most customers barely looked at him, treating him like part of the furniture. But Victoria Stone looked directly at him. Really looked. Like she was seeing a person rather than just a service. "Thai palace order," he said, extending the bag. "Pad Thai, no peanuts, extra lime on the side." "Perfect." She took the bag, their fingers brushing briefly. Hers were soft but cold, like she'd been standing by a window. "Wait just a moment." She disappeared back into the apartment, leaving Mike standing in the doorway. He caught a glimpse of the space beyond soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, but something about it felt hollow, like a beautiful stage set waiting for actors who never arrived. Victoria returned with her phone, tapping the screen. "I've added a little something extra to the tip," she said. "The weather's terrible, and I appreciate you coming all the way up here." Mike's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and nearly dropped the device. $100 tip for a $8 order. "Ma'am, this has to be a mistake," he said, looking up at her. It's not a mistake," Victoria said, her smile sad but genuine. "Buy something nice for your daughter." Mike's breath caught. "How did you—" "Your car," she said gently. "There's a proud parent of an honor student sticker on your back window, and a violin case in the back seat." For a moment, and they stood there in the doorway, stranger and customer, both recognizing something in the other that transcended their circumstances. "Thank you," Mike said finally, his voice rough around the edges. This, this means more than you know." Victoria nodded when stepping back. "Stay safe out there, Michael." As the elevator descended, Mike stared at his phone screen, at the number that would cover Emma's violin lessons for 3 months. He thought about the woman behind the door, alone in all that luxury, and wondered what kind of loneliness could live in a place so beautiful. He had no idea that 47 floors above him, Victoria Stone stood at her window watching his battered Honda disappear into the storm, feeling something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the warmth of genuine human connection. Over the next 2 weeks, the orders came like clockwork. Always the same customer, Victoria Stone. Always simple meal: soup, salad, sometimes a sandwich, and always, without fail, tips that made Mike's hands shake when he saw them. $100 for chicken noodle soup, $150 for a Caesar salad, $200 for vegetable lo mein. Mike had tried refusing them, tried explaining that the amounts were excessive, but Victoria had a way of looking at him that made arguing impossible. Not condescending or pitying, just matter of fact, like generosity was as natural as breathing. "You work 3 jobs," she'd said during his 4th delivery, when he'd attempted again to protest a $175 tip for tomato soup. "I looked you up on LinkedIn. Construction during the day, deliveries in the evening, security guard on weekends. When do you sleep?" Mike had stared at her, unsure whether to be flattered or disturbed that she'd researched him. "When I can afford to," he'd said finally. "Everyone deserves rest. Michael, consider this an investment in your sleep schedule." Now, standing outside her door again with an order of Chinese takeout, Mike found himself looking forward to their brief conversations. Victoria never seemed rushed, never made him feel like he was interrupting something more important. She asked about Emma, remembered details from previous visits, listened like his answers actually mattered. The door opened before he could knock. "I saw you coming up the street," Victoria said, taking the bag. "You're 10 minutes early tonight. Light traffic, people staying in because of the cold." "Smart people." She stepped aside. "Would you like to come in for a moment, warm up before you head back out?" Mike hesitated. Fraternizing with customers wasn't exactly encouraged, and part of him worried about the implications of a 50-year-old woman inviting him into her apartment. But the wind cutting through the hallway was brutal, and Victoria's expression was innocent enough. "Just for a minute," he said. The penthouse was even more impressive from the inside. Original hardwood floors, modern furniture that looked like it cost more than Mike's annual salary, artwork that belonged in galleries. But what struck him most was how quiet it was. Not just peaceful empty, like a house where only one person lived, and that person was very much alone. "Coffee?" Victoria asked, moving toward a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a cooking show. "I have a machine that does everything except drink it for you." "Coffee sounds great." She moved efficiently around the kitchen, and Mike found himself studying her. There was something almost choreographed about the way she prepared the drinks, like she'd performed this routine countless times but rarely for anyone else. Her hands were graceful but careful, the movements of someone who'd learned to find comfort in small rituals. "You said you looked me up," Mike said, accepting the mug she offered. The coffee was perfect, rich and hot, and better than anything he'd tasted in months. "Fair's fair. I looked you up too." Victoria's face didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "And what did you find?" "Not much. Victoria Stone, resident of Millennium Tower for 3 years. Before that," he shrugged, "the trail goes cold, like you didn't exist before you moved here." "Maybe I didn't," Victoria said softly, settling into the chair across from him. "Maybe I'm a completely different person now." "We all reinvent ourselves sometimes," Mike said. "After my wife died, I felt like I had to become someone entirely new. Father and mother both. Provider and nurturer. Some days I still don't know if I'm doing it right." Victoria's expression softened. "I'm sorry about your wife. That must have been devastating." "Cancer," Mike said simply. 3 years ago, Emma was 9. Old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to process it. You know, some nights she still crawls into my bed because she's afraid I'll disappear too. "And are you afraid you'll disappear?" The question caught him off guard. Mike set down his coffee, considering. "Sometimes, not die exactly, but fade away. Like I'll work so hard to take care of everything that I'll forget how to be anything except tired." Victoria nodded slowly. "I understand that feeling. Sometimes I think if I sat still long enough, I'd just dissolve into the furniture." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people who'd found themselves in circumstances they'd never planned for, making the best of lives that had taken unexpected turns. "What did you do?" Mike asked. "Before you moved here." Victoria's hands tightened slightly around her mug. "I was married. My husband ran a technology company. When he died, I couldn't handle the responsibility. I sold everything and disappeared." The words had the rehearsed quality of a story told many times, but there was pain underneath that felt genuine. Mike didn't push. He understood about stories that were true enough, even if they weren't completely accurate. "I should go," he said, finishing his coffee. "Emma's expecting me home by 9. "Of course." Victoria walked him to the door. "Michael, thank you. For the coffee break, I don't get much company." "Thank you for the warmth," Mike replied. "And for everything else, you're changing our lives. You know that." Victoria smiled, but there was something sad in it. "Maybe you're changing mine too." The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday night in early December. Mike had arrived with Victoria's usual order soup and bread from a local deli to find her agitated in a way he'd never seen before. She was pacing the living room when she answered the door, phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp with frustration. "No, Robert, I told you I'm not interested in discussing this," she was saying. "The decision is final. I don't care what the board thinks." She gestured for Mike to come in, mouthing an apology as she continued her conversation. "Because I lived with the consequences of his choices for 30 years. That's why. I'm not going to let you destroy what he built just because you think you know better. No, don't you dare bring up the stockholders. You have no idea what you're talking about." Victoria ended the call with more force than necessary and turned to Mike with an expression somewhere between anger and exhaustion. "Family," she said by way of explanation. "They never know when to let go." "Rough conversation. My brother-in-law," Victoria said, sinking into her chair. "He thinks I should sell my husband's company. Apparently, the board is getting restless with an absentee owner making decisions from a distance." Mike set down the soup and studied her face. This was the most animated he'd ever seen Victoria, and despite her obvious frustration, she seemed more alive than usual. "What kind of company?" he asked. "Technology, software development, mainly digital security systems, some government contracts." Victoria rubbed her temples. "My husband built it from nothing. 30 years of his life, and Robert wants to sell it to some conglomerate that'll strip it for parts. But it's yours now to decide. Controlling interest? Yes, but I haven't been actively involved since he died. I've been letting the board run things, which Robert thinks means I'm not capable of making decisions. Her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of old wounds. He forgets that I was there for every major decision my husband made. I might not have the MBA, but I understand the business. Mike found himself leaning forward, interested despite himself. So why not take control back if you know the business? Victoria looked at him for a long moment, something calculating behind her eyes. Because I'm tired, Michael. Bone-deep tired. The kind of tired that comes from fighting battles you never wanted to fight in the first place. What would your husband want you to do? The question seemed to surprise her. Victoria's expression softened, became distant. He'd want me to fight. He always said the company was his legacy, that it represented something bigger than profit margins and quarterly reports. He believed technology should serve people, not the other way around. Sounds like a good man. He was, Victoria said simply. He was brilliant and kind and completely devoted to his work. Sometimes I think he loved that company more than he loved me. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Mike recognized the tone. It was the same way he sometimes talked about Sarah, with love and loss and the complicated resentment that came from being left behind. After Sarah died, he said carefully, I was angry at her for a long time. Angry that she left me to figure everything out alone. Angry that she got to escape and I had to stay and deal with the mess. It wasn't rational, but grief isn't rational. Victoria nodded. Yes, exactly that. But then I realized that the anger was just love with nowhere to go, and maybe the best way to honor her was to take care of the things she cared about, which was Emma, mainly, but also the idea of family she'd built with us. You think I should fight for the company? I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. But if your husband built something worth preserving, and you're the only one who can preserve it, Mike shrugged. Maybe that's worth fighting for. Victoria was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city below. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been all evening. Hayes Digital Solutions, she said. That was the name of the company. Robert keeps pushing for a sale to Meridian Corp, but their track record with acquisitions is terrible. They buy innovative companies and gut them for patents. Then don't let them. It's not that simple. I'd have to come out of hiding, so to speak. Get involved again. Face the board, the investors, the press. Victoria shuddered slightly. I've gotten used to being invisible. Sometimes invisible gets lonely, Mike said gently. Victoria looked at him then, really looked, and Mike saw something in her expression shift. A decision being made, a door being opened. Would you like to see something? She asked. She led him to a room he'd never been in before, clearly her home office. The space was dominated by multiple computer monitors, whiteboards covered in diagrams and flowcharts, and shelves lined with technical manuals and industry publications. This room, unlike the rest of the apartment, felt lived in, purposeful. I haven't been as absent as Robert thinks, Victoria said, settling into the chair at her desk. I've been watching, learning, planning. The company's in good shape, but it's stagnating, playing it safe instead of innovating. She pulled up several documents on her computer: financial reports, market analyses, development timelines. Mike couldn't understand most of what he was seeing, but he could see the passion in Victoria's face as she explained it. We could revolutionize home security systems, she said, pointing to a series of diagrams. Integration with smart home technology, AI-driven threat assessment, privacy protections that actually protect privacy, but the board wants to stick with government contracts because they're safer. You've been working on this alone for months. Sometimes I think it's the only thing keeping me sane. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. Robert would probably have me declared incompetent if he knew I was spending my days playing with computer code. Does he know about technology? Your brother-in-law, Robert's background is in finance. He sees numbers, not possibilities. Victoria turned to face Mike fully. What would you do, Michael, if you had the chance to save something important, but it meant giving up the quiet life you'd built? Mike thought about it seriously, considering not just the question, but the woman asking it, Victoria Stone. He was beginning to realize was far more complex than the lonely widow he'd initially taken her for. I'd probably be scared as hell, he said finally. But I'd do it anyway, because some things are worth being scared for. Victoria smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all evening. Thank you. For listening, for understanding. I don't have many people I can talk to about this. Anytime, Mike said. Though I have to admit, I'm curious about something. What's that? If you're the owner of a major tech company, why are you ordering takeout and living like a hermit? Shouldn't you be in boardrooms and corner offices? Victoria's expression became guarded again. It's complicated, Michael. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you have to be most careful around. The cryptic answer bothered Mike as he drove home that night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria Stone was carrying secrets far heavier than a simple case of grief and business disputes. The manila envelope appeared under Mike's apartment door on a Saturday morning, unmarked except for his name written in Victoria's distinctive handwriting. Inside, he found architectural plans, contractor estimates, and a letter that made him read it 3 times before the words sank in. Michael, I have a proposition for you. The penthouse has been neglected since I moved in Beautiful Bones, but it needs updating to be truly functional. Kitchen renovation, bathroom remodeling, maybe some built-in shelving and storage solutions. The kind of work that requires someone skilled, trustworthy, and detail-oriented. I've gotten estimates from several contractors, but they all feel wrong somehow. Too impersonal, too focused on billing hours rather than creating something lasting. Then I remembered what you told me about wanting to start your own construction business. Would you consider taking on this project? I can offer $50, $1,000 for the complete renovation, plus materials. It would probably take 6 to 8 weeks, working evenings and weekends around your other jobs. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think you'd understand what I'm trying to create here. Think about it. There's no pressure and no obligation. Victoria Mike stared at the letter until Emma's voice broke through his concentration. Dad, you look like you've seen a ghost. He looked up to find his daughter standing in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for her Saturday violin lesson, her dark hair pulled back in the ponytail Sarah used to help her with. At 12, Emma was beginning to show signs of the young woman she'd become taller, more serious, with her mother's expressive eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Not a ghost, Mike said, folding the letter carefully. An opportunity? Good opportunity or scary opportunity? Both. Probably. Emma poured herself a glass of orange juice and settled into the chair across from him. This was their Saturday morning ritual. Quiet conversation over breakfast before the day's activities claimed them both. Is it about the soup lady? Emma asked. Mike raised an eyebrow. The soup lady. Victoria, you talk about her sometimes when you come home from deliveries. You get this weird expression, like you're trying to solve a puzzle. She's just a customer. A customer who tips you enough to pay for my violin lessons, Emma said pointedly. I'm not stupid. Dad, I know we've been struggling, and I know things got easier after you started delivering to her. Mike studied his daughter's face, seeing too much awareness there for a 12-year-old. He'd tried to shield her from their financial stress, but Emma was observant and intelligent. Of course she'd noticed the changes. She offered me a job, he said finally. A big one. Renovating her apartment. That's good, right? You love construction work. It's complicated. The money is substantial, more than I'd normally charge for a project like this. Emma frowned. You think she's being too generous. I think she's lonely and maybe not thinking clearly about business decisions. Or maybe she recognizes good work when she sees it, Emma said. Remember when you fixed Mrs. Peterson's porch. She said you were the most careful contractor she'd ever hired. Maybe Victoria sees the same thing. Mike looked at his daughter with fresh appreciation. When had she become so wise? There's something else, he said. Taking this job would mean less time for deliveries, less steady income. It's a gamble. Dad, Emma said gently, everything's a gamble, but some bets are worth taking. That afternoon, Mike found himself standing outside Victoria's door with the plans under his arm and a decision made. When she answered, she was wearing paint-splattered jeans and an old sweater, her hair tied back with what looked like a rubber band. I was hoping you'd come by, she said, stepping aside to let him in. I've been thinking about your offer, Mike said without preamble. It's generous. Too generous. I disagree. Victoria, I looked up similar projects online. The going rate for what you're describing is maybe $35,000, and that's with premium materials. Victoria led him to the kitchen, where she'd spread out additional plans and photos on the counter. This isn't about market rates, Michael. It's about finding someone who'll treat this space like it matters. She pointed to a series of photos showing luxurious but cold-looking interiors. These are what the other contractors proposed. Beautiful, expensive, completely impersonal. They want to turn this place into a showroom. Then she showed him a different set of images, warm, livable spaces that felt like homes rather than magazine spreads. This is what I want, she said. Something that feels real, lived in, like a place where someone could actually be happy. Mike studied the photos, beginning to understand her vision. You want it to feel like a home, not just a place you live. Exactly. And I think you understand the difference. Why me? Though you could hire a firm with experience in high-end residential work. Victoria was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter. Because when you talk about your apartment, about the things you've built and fixed for Emma, your whole face changes. You don't just see construction projects, you see the life that happens inside the spaces you create. The observation caught Mike off guard with its accuracy. That's, yes. I suppose that's true. I need someone who understands that homes are about more than architecture. They're about safety and comfort and the possibility of new beginnings. Victoria looked at him directly. I think you might be that person. Mike found himself nodding before he'd fully made the decision. All right, but I want to modify the terms slightly. Oh, 40,000, not 50, and I provide a detailed breakdown of all expenses. You're not hiring me as a charity case. Victoria, you're hiring me because you think I can do good work. Victoria smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her. Deal. When can you start? Next weekend. But I have one condition. What's that? Emma comes with me sometimes. I don't like leaving her alone on weekends, and she's actually pretty handy with tools. I'd like that, Victoria said. I don't get much chance to be around young people anymore. As they shook hands, Mike felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a construction job, it was the beginning of something bigger. A chance to build the business he'd always dreamed of, and maybe, in the process, to build something else entirely. He had no idea that 47 floors below, in the building's security office, cameras had recorded every one of his visits, or that somewhere in Washington, D.C., federal agents were building a file with his name on it. The knock came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, sharp and authoritative in a way that made Mike's blood freeze before he was fully awake. Emma was still asleep, and for a moment he considered not answering, pretending no one was home. But the knocking came again, more insistent this time, and Mike pulled on a robe and went to the door. Through the peephole, he saw two people in dark suits standing in his hallway. The woman was tall and blonde, with the kind of posture that suggested military training. The man was older, with graying hair and tired eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Michael Thompson, the woman asked when he opened the door. Yes, I'm Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. This is Agent Robert Martinez. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Victoria Stone. Mike's stomach dropped. Is she in some kind of trouble? May we come in? Agent Chen asked, which wasn't really a question. Mike's living room suddenly felt very small with two federal agents standing in it. Emma's violin case leaned against the wall, homework scattered across the coffee table. The normal detritus of their quiet life suddenly seeming fragile under official scrutiny. Mr. Thompson, Agent Martinez said, settling into Mike's second-hand armchair like he belonged there. How long have you known Ms. Stone? About 6 weeks. She's a customer. I deliver food to her apartment. And you've developed a personal relationship with her. Mike felt his defenses rising. I wouldn't call it personal. She's been generous with tips, and we've had a few conversations. That's all. Agent Chen pulled out a tablet and showed him a series of photographs. Mike in the lobby of Millennium Tower. Mike entering the penthouse elevator. Mike's car parked outside the building at various times over the past month. You've visited her residence 14 times in the past 6 weeks, Agent Chen said. Several of those visits lasted over an hour. That seems like more than a delivery relationship. She hired me to do some renovation work, Mike said, his mouth suddenly dry. What's this about? The agents exchanged a look that made Mike's anxiety spike. Mr. Thompson, Agent Martinez said carefully. What did Ms. Stone tell you about her background? She said she was a widow. Her husband died and left her his business. She's been dealing with family pressure to sell the company. Did she mention the name of the company? Hayes Digital Solutions? Another exchanged look. Agent Chen leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, we need you to understand that the person you know as Victoria Stone may not be who she claims to be. What do you mean, 3 years ago? Victoria Hayes, CEO of Hayes Digital Solutions, disappeared following a federal investigation into corporate fraud and embezzlement. $2 billion went missing from government contracts, and Ms. Hayes vanished the day before she was scheduled to testify before a grand jury. The words hit Mike like a physical blow. That's impossible. Victoria isn't. She's not a criminal. She's been living under the assumed identity of Victoria Stone, Agent Martinez continued. Falsified documents, cash transactions, no credit history before 3 years ago. She's been evading federal authorities while living in luxury on stolen money. Mike shook his head, trying to process what he was hearing. No, you're wrong. She's not. She's just a lonely woman who lost her husband. Mr. Thompson, Agent Chen said gently, we understand this is difficult, but Victoria Hayes is a federal fugitive, and your association with her puts you in a potentially compromising position. What kind of compromising position? Accessory after the fact, aiding and abetting a fugitive, money laundering, if you've accepted payment from her for services. Mike's legs suddenly felt unsteady. He sank into the couch, his mind racing. She tipped me, generously, and she hired me for legitimate construction work. I had no idea she was wanted by the FBI. We believe you, Agent Martinez said, but we need your help to bring her in. You want me to betray her trust. We want you to help us apprehend a federal fugitive who's been living on stolen money while honest taxpayers foot the bill. Agent Chen said firmly. What would you want me to do? Continue your relationship with her? Wear a wire when you visit? Help us gather evidence about her current activities and any assets she might have hidden? Mike stared at them, feeling sick. And if I refuse, then you become a person of interest in an ongoing federal investigation, Agent Martinez said. We freeze your assets, examine every financial transaction you've made in the past 6 weeks, interview your daughter, your employers, your neighbors. Even if you're ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, the process could take months, maybe years. The implicit threat was clear. Mike thought about Emma, still asleep in her bedroom, unaware that their world was about to change again. I need time to think about this, he said. You have 24 hours, Agent Chen said, standing. We'll be in touch. After they left, Mike sat in his living room for a long time, staring at nothing. Everything he thought he knew about Victoria Stone was apparently a lie. The generous tips, the renovation job, the quiet conversations about loss and loneliness, all of it built on a foundation of deception. But even as he tried to process the betrayal, part of him couldn't reconcile the woman he'd gotten to know with the federal fugitive the agents described. Victoria's pain when she talked about her husband had seemed genuine. Her loneliness was real. The way she'd looked at Emma's photo, the careful way she'd prepared coffee, the vulnerability in her voice when she talked about feeling invisible, none of that felt like performance. When Emma emerged from her bedroom an hour later, dressed for school and humming under her breath, Mike made a decision. He wouldn't lie to his daughter, but he wouldn't destroy her world with information she didn't need to carry. "Dad," Emma said, noticing his expression, "you look terrible. Are you sick?" "Just tired, sweetheart. Didn't sleep well. Maybe you should take a day off. Stay home, watch bad movies. Eat ice cream for breakfast." Mike managed a smile. "That sounds perfect. But I can't. I have work. The renovation project, among other things." Emma studied his face with the intuition that still surprised him. "Dad, is everything okay with Victoria? I mean," Mike looked at his daughter, intelligent, perceptive, trusting, and felt the weight of protecting her from a world that was more complicated and dangerous than he'd ever imagined. "I'm not sure, he said honestly, "but I'm going to figure it out." That evening, as Mike drove toward Millennium Tower with a wire taped to his chest and federal agents listening to every word, he wondered if he was about to destroy the first real connection he'd felt with another adult since Sarah died, or if he was about to discover that Victoria Stone had been destroying him all along. The penthouse felt different that night. Victoria met Mike at the door wearing the same paint-splattered clothes from their last meeting, but her face was drawn with exhaustion, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Why wouldn't I come?" Mike asked, acutely aware of the wire against his chest, the weight of betrayal in his own voice. "Robert called this morning. He said there's been FBI activity around the company. Agents asking questions about me, about where I've been, what I've been doing." Victoria moved to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. "I think they found me. Michael." Mike's heart hammered against his ribs. The agents had said nothing about investigating Hayes Digital Solutions directly. "What kind of questions? About the missing money? About my disappearance? About whether I've been in contact with anyone from the company?" Victoria turned to face him, and Mike saw something in her expression that he couldn't read. "I need to tell you something. About who I really am, Victoria." "My name isn't Victoria Stone," she said quietly. "It's Victoria Hayes, and I'm not hiding from grief. Michael, I'm hiding from federal charges that could put me in prison for the rest of my life." Mike forced himself to look surprised, though the admission felt like confirmation of fears that had been growing since the agent's visit. "What kind of charges?" "Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy." Victoria laughed bitterly. $2 billion disappeared from Hayes Digital Solutions, and everyone thinks I took it. "Did you?" The question hung in the air between them. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, and Mike wondered if she could somehow sense the wire, the invisible audience listening to every word. "No," she said finally, "but I can't prove it. And the person who can clear my name is the same person who set me up in the first place." "Who?" "Robert Hayes, my brother-in-law, the one who's been pressuring me to sell the company." Victoria moved to her home office, gesturing for Mike to follow. She pulled up a series of documents on her computer: financial records, email chains, corporate filings that meant nothing to Mike, but clearly told a story she'd been piecing together for 3 years. "After my husband died, I was devastated," she said, her fingers moving over the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Clinical depression, barely functioning, completely overwhelmed by the responsibility of running a company I'd never officially been part of. Robert offered to help, temporary management while I grieved. That sounds reasonable." It was reasonable. For about 6 months. Then I started noticing irregularities. Money moving between accounts, contracts being modified, payments being made to companies I'd never heard of. Victoria pulled up a spreadsheet that looked like a maze of numbers and codes. When I asked Robert about it, he said it was all routine corporate restructuring, tax optimization. I didn't understand the details, so I trusted him. But something wasn't right. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Robert had been systematically siphoning money from government contracts, using my digital signature on documents I'd never seen. When the FBI started investigating, he made sure all the evidence pointed back to me. Mike studied the documents Victoria was showing him, trying to follow the trail of financial transactions. This is all circumstantial, isn't it? You can't prove he forged your signature. Not directly, but I can prove I was in psychiatric treatment during most of the time these transactions took place. I have medical records, therapy session notes, prescription records, evidence that I was barely capable of getting dressed, let alone orchestrating a $2 billion embezzlement scheme. Then why didn't you present that evidence to the FBI? Victoria's expression grew grim. Because Robert had me declared mentally incompetent, temporary conservatorship while I received treatment. Legally, I wasn't allowed to make financial decisions for the company, but somehow my digital signature kept appearing on documents. The implications hit Mike like a sledgehammer. He used your illness against you. Depression made me vulnerable, and Robert exploited that vulnerability. He stole from the company, framed me for the theft, and then used my mental health as both the weapon and the shield. Mike felt sick, and not just because of the wire recording every word of Victoria's confession. Why didn't you fight it, come forward with the medical evidence? Because by the time I was well enough to understand what had happened, Robert had convinced everyone, including my own lawyers, that I was having a breakdown and making paranoid accusations against family. Victoria's voice cracked slightly. I was isolated, medicated, and surrounded by people who thought I was delusional. Even I started to doubt my own memories. So you ran. I disappeared the night before I was supposed to testify. Robert's lawyers had convinced me that anything I said would only make things worse, that the best thing for everyone was for me to quietly step aside and let the legal process play out. Victoria closed the laptop and turned to face Mike fully. I've been hiding for 3 years. Michael, living on money I saved before Robert took control, trying to gather evidence that might clear my name. And have you gathered evidence? Some, but not enough. I need access to the company's servers, internal communications, financial records that only someone with administrative privileges can access. Mike felt the weight of the moment, the knowledge that federal agents were listening to every word, building their case against the woman who'd shown him more kindness than he'd experienced in years. Victoria, he said carefully, what are you asking me to do? I'm not asking you to do anything, she said. I'm telling you the truth because you deserve to know who you've been spending time with. You have a daughter to protect. Michael, you can't afford to be associated with a federal fugitive. Is that why you've been so generous? The tips, the renovation job. Guilt money. Victoria flinched as if he'd struck her. Is that what you think? I don't know what to think anymore. The money I've given you came from my personal savings, not from anything stolen. I've been generous because you've been kind to me, and because kindness is rare enough that it should be rewarded. Victoria's voice grew stronger, more certain. But you're right to be suspicious. You're right to protect yourself and Emma. She moved to a desk drawer and pulled out an envelope, thick with cash. This is enough to cover the renovation work we discussed, plus compensation for your time. Considerate payment for services not rendered. Mike stared at the envelope, understanding that she was offering him an exit, a clean break from whatever legal troubles might be heading her way. What will you do? He asked. I don't know. Maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to face the charges and hope the truth eventually comes out. Or maybe it's time to fight back. Victoria looked at him sharply. What do you mean Mike made a decision that surprised him even as he made it? He reached under his shirt and pulled out the wire, holding it where Victoria could see it. The FBI came to see me this morning, he said. They wanted me to gather evidence against you. Victoria stared at the device, her face cycling through shock, betrayal, and finally, a strange kind of relief. How long have you been recording me? Since I walked in tonight. But Victoria, Mike looked directly into her eyes. I believe you. Why? Because I've seen you with Emma. I've watched you make coffee and talk about your husband and light up when you discuss technology. I've seen you be real in ways that can't be faked. Mike set the wire on the coffee table between them. And because Robert Hayes has been trying too hard to make you look guilty. What do you mean? The agents mentioned that your brother-in-law has been cooperating with the investigation, providing information about your whereabouts, your activities, your state of mind. For a man who supposedly wants to help you, he's been remarkably helpful to the people trying to arrest you. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. You're going to get in trouble for this, for not cooperating with a federal investigation. Maybe, but Emma's going to be proud that her father stood up for someone who needed standing up for. Michael, Victoria said softly, you don't understand what you're risking. I understand perfectly. The question is, are you ready to stop running and start fighting? Victoria looked at the wire on the table, then at Mike, then out the window at the city where she'd been hiding for 3 years. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strength he'd never heard before. Yes, she said. I think I am. The call came at 11 o'clock that night. Victoria's phone buzzed with Robert Hayes' name on the display, and Mike watched her face harden as she answered. Hello, Aunt Robert. Victoria, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Robert's voice carried through the speaker, smooth and concerned in a way that immediately put Mike on edge. We need to talk. It's urgent. About what? The FBI investigation. They're asking questions about you, about the company, about money transfers from 3 years ago. I think someone might be feeding them information to make you look guilty. Mike and Victoria exchanged glances. Robert's words were carefully chosen, designed to sound supportive while subtly reinforcing the narrative that Victoria was responsible for the missing funds. What kind of information, Victoria asked? Financial records, communications, evidence of your state of mind during the transition period after Marcus died. Robert's voice took on a tone of fake sympathy. Victoria, I'm worried they're building a case against you based on incomplete information. Incomplete how? They don't understand how devastated you were, how the depression affected your judgment. If they knew about the medication you were taking, the therapy sessions, they might be more understanding about any irregularities in your decision-making during that time. Mike felt his jaw clench. Robert was laying the groundwork for an insanity defense while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that Victoria had, in fact, made the decisions that led to the missing money. Robert, Victoria said, her voice steady, I want to ask you something directly. Did you forge my digital signature on financial documents while I was receiving treatment? There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Robert spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more cautious. Victoria, you're not thinking clearly. The stress of this investigation is obviously affecting you. Maybe you should consider turning yourself in, getting proper legal representation. That's not what I asked you. Victoria, please, let me help you. I can arrange for you to surrender voluntarily, maybe work out some kind of plea agreement. But if you keep hiding, if you keep making wild accusations, Victoria's voice rose slightly. Robert, I have evidence. What kind of evidence? Mike could hear the sharp interest in Robert's voice now, the careful probing of someone trying to assess a threat. Financial records showing money transfers I never authorized, email communications with contractors I never spoke to, digital signatures on documents I never saw. Victoria looked at Mike as she spoke, drawing strength from his presence. I also have medical records proving I was incapacitated during most of the time period when these transactions occurred. Victoria, you're scaring me. This sounds like paranoid thinking. Maybe the medication affected your memory more than you realize. Robert, stop. Victoria's voice cut through his words like a blade. I know what you did. I know how you used my illness to steal from the company and frame me for the theft. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was different, colder, more calculating. Victoria, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. You were mentally ill. You made poor decisions. The FBI has evidence of those decisions, and if you try to blame me for your mistakes, you're only going to make things worse for yourself. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. You can't prove anything. Victoria, you were legally incompetent during the time period in question, which means any testimony you might offer about your mental state is suspect. Meanwhile, I have 3 years of documented communications showing my attempts to help you, to protect the company from your erratic behavior, to cover for your mistakes out of family loyalty. Mike watched Victoria's face as the true scope of Robert's manipulation became clear. He hadn't just stolen money, he'd spent years building a narrative that painted Victoria as an unreliable witness to her own victimization. You planned this, Victoria said quietly. From the beginning, you waited until I was vulnerable, and then you used my grief against me. I protected you, Robert snapped, his mask finally slipping. Do you have any idea how much money you cost this company with your emotional decisions? How many bad contracts you approved while you were too drugged up to think straight? I saved Hayes Digital Solutions from bankruptcy, and this is how you repay me. By stealing $2 billion, by making necessary decisions that you were too weak to make yourself. And now, Robert's voice was fully cold now, all pretense of sympathy gone. And now you want to destroy everything I've built because you can't accept responsibility for your own failures. Victoria looked at Mike, her expression a mixture of vindication and fury. Robert had just confessed to everything: the manipulation, the unauthorized financial decisions, the cover-up. But they both knew that a phone conversation wouldn't be enough to clear Victoria's name with the FBI. Robert, Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled, I want to make you an offer. What kind of offer? Meet with me. Tonight. Let's settle this face to face. Without lawyers or federal agents or board members. Just family. Victoria, I don't think that's wise. I'm not going to run anymore. Robert, but before I turn myself in, I want to understand why you did this. Why you destroyed Marcus's legacy. Why you were willing to destroy me. Mike could hear the calculation in Robert's silence, the weighing of options and risks. Where? Robert asked finally. The company, Hayes Digital Solutions, the executive conference room where Marcus used to hold board meetings. The building will be locked. I still have administrative access to the security systems. I can get us in. Another pause. Victoria, if this is some kind of trap, it's not a trap. Robert, it's a conversation. 1 hour. Just you and me. To settle things between us before I face the consequences of your choices. All right, Robert said after a long moment. 1 hour. But Victoria, if you're thinking about recording this conversation or involving law enforcement, remember that I have 3 years of documentation showing your mental instability. Any evidence you think you have will be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a disturbed woman. The line went dead. Victoria set down the phone and looked at Mike with an expression that was part determination, part terror. He's going to come, she said, and he's going to try to manipulate me into taking responsibility for what he did. Then we need to be smarter than he is. Mike picked up the FBI wire from the coffee table, turning it over in his hands. Victoria, I think it's time to call Agent Chen. Hayes Digital Solutions occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in Chicago's River North District. Its lobby dominated by a portrait of Marcus Hayes, a kind-faced man in his 50s, whose eyes seemed to follow visitors as they passed. Victoria stood beneath her late husband's image at 1:30 a.m., her hands shaking slightly as she used her administrative access to override the building's security system. Mike stood beside her, wearing a new wire provided by Agent Chen, who was positioned with a tactical team in a van outside the building. The plan was simple: get Robert to confess to the embezzlement and manipulation while federal agents recorded every word. He'll be suspicious, Victoria said as they rode the elevator to the 23rd floor. Robert's paranoid by nature, and he knows I have nothing left to lose. Then we'll have to make him feel like he's in control, Mike replied. Let him think he's manipulating you one last time. The executive conference room was exactly as Mike had imagined it. Polished wood table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But what dominated the space were the photographs lining the walls: Marcus Hayes with various politicians, technology leaders, and innovators. A visual history of a company built on genuine achievement. He loved this room, Victoria said softly, running her fingers along the table's edge. Said it reminded him why we were working so hard. To make the world better. To prove that good people could succeed without compromising their principles. Victoria's voice carried a bitterness earned through 3 years of hiding. Robert never understood that. For him, business was always about winning, regardless of the cost. They didn't have to wait long. Robert Hayes arrived at exactly 2:00 a.m., using his own access card and moving through the building like he owned it, which Mike realized he effectively did. Robert was smaller than Mike had expected, perhaps 55, with prematurely gray hair and the soft look of a man who'd spent his career behind a desk. But his eyes were sharp and calculating, the eyes of someone who'd learned to see people as problems to be solved or resources to be exploited. Victoria, he said as he entered the conference room, his voice carrying false warmth. You look well. Hiding seems to agree with you. Hello, Robert. Robert's gaze shifted to Mike, and his expression hardened. I thought this was going to be a private conversation. Michael is my friend, Victoria said simply. He knows everything. Everything. Robert's voice carried a dangerous edge. That's interesting, because everything includes some very unflattering details about your mental state during the transition period. Mike watched the interaction carefully, noting how Robert immediately went on the offensive, using Victoria's past illness as both a weapon and a shield. Robert, I want you to know that I'm not recording this conversation, Victoria said, which was technically true. Mike was the one wearing the wire. I just want to understand why you did what you did. What I did, Robert moved to the head of the table, positioning himself in what had clearly been Marcus's chair. Victoria, I saved this company. When Marcus died and you fell apart, someone had to make the hard decisions. By stealing $2 billion, by reallocating resources to keep the company solvent while you were too medicated to function? Robert's tone was patient, condescending. Victoria, you were signing documents you hadn't read, approving contracts you didn't understand, making financial commitments that would have bankrupted us within 6 months. So you forged my signature on new documents. I used the authority you'd given me during your conservatorship to make necessary corrections. Robert leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. Everything I did was legally protected under the mental health provisions Marcus had written into the company charter. Mike felt his anger rising at Robert's casual admission of manipulation, but Victoria remained calm, drawing her brother-in-law deeper into confession. The FBI seems to think the money was stolen, not reallocated, Victoria said. The FBI doesn't understand corporate finance. They see large transfers and assume theft, but they don't understand the complexity of government contracts or the need for flexible cash flow management. Robert's voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who'd rehearsed these explanations for years. When the investigation is complete, they'll see that every dollar can be accounted for. Then why are they still looking for me? Robert's expression grew cold. Because you ran, Victoria. Because instead of trusting me to protect you, you disappeared and made yourself look guilty. Now I have to spend my time cleaning up the mess you created instead of running the company Marcus built. The company you've been trying to sell to Meridian Corp. The company I've been trying to save from federal seizure. Robert stood and moved to the window, his back to Victoria and Mike. Do you have any idea what the past 3 years have been like dealing with investigators, managing a board that thinks the CEO is a fugitive, trying to maintain investor confidence while the press speculates about missing billions. I'm sure it's been difficult, Victoria said, her voice carefully neutral. It's been hell, and all because you couldn't handle the responsibility Marcus left you. Robert turned back to face them, and Mike saw something ugly in his expression. You were always weak, Victoria. Marcus knew it. The board knew it. Everyone knew it except you. Marcus never said I was weak. Marcus protected you from reality because he felt sorry for you. The mousy librarian he married out of pity, who never really understood what he was building. Robert's voice grew crueler with each word. Did you really think you could run $1 billion company? Did you actually believe you were qualified to make decisions that affected thousands of employees? Mike watched Victoria absorb the verbal assault, saw her face grow pale, but her posture remained steady. She was drawing Robert out, letting him reveal the contempt that had motivated years of manipulation. So you decided to save everyone from my incompetence, Victoria said quietly. I decided to save the company from destruction. Marcus's vision, his legacy, everything he worked for, I preserved it all while you hid in therapy and blamed everyone else for your problems. By framing me for embezzlement, by accepting responsibility for decisions that needed to be made, Robert returned to his chair, leaning forward with the intensity of a man making his final argument. Victoria, you can keep fighting this, but you'll lose. I have documentation of every erratic decision you made, every time you signed papers without reading them, every instance where your medication affected your judgment. I have medical records showing your depression, therapy notes documenting your paranoid thoughts, prescription records proving you were taking drugs that impaired your cognitive function. You had access to my medical records. I had access to everything. Victoria, conservatorship means I was legally responsible for your welfare, which included monitoring your treatment and protecting you from the consequences of your illness. Mike felt sick listening to Robert's casual description of how he'd violated Victoria's privacy and used her medical information against her. But Victoria pressed on, drawing more admissions from her brother-in-law, and the money that disappeared was moved to secure accounts to protect it from seizure during the investigation. When this is all over, when you've accepted responsibility for your part in the chaos, the funds will be returned to the company. Under your control, under proper management, yes. Robert smiled then, and it was the coldest expression Mike had ever seen. Victoria, you need to understand something. You can't win this fight. I have the law on my side. I have the documentation. I have 3 years of carefully constructed evidence showing that you were mentally incompetent and made disastrous decisions that I've been trying to fix. What if I told you I remembered everything, Victoria asked. What if I told you that my memory of events was perfectly clear and I could testify about what really happened? Robert laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. Then I'd say your testimony would be dismissed as the fantasies of a woman with a documented history of mental illness and paranoid delusions. Victoria, you were legally declared incompetent. Anything you say about this time period is automatically suspect. Even if I had evidence, what evidence could you possibly have? You were sedated and hospitalized for months. You signed papers without reading them, approved transfers without understanding them, delegated authority without maintaining oversight. Robert's confidence was absolute now, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who believed he'd covered every angle. I made sure of that, Victoria. Every document you signed, every decision you appeared to make, can be explained by your mental state at the time. You made sure of it. Robert froze, realizing what he'd just admitted. Mike saw the moment when Robert understood that he'd been too confident, too eager to demonstrate his superior planning. I mean, Robert said carefully, I documented your condition to protect you from future accusations that you'd acted with criminal intent. But it was too late. The admission hung in the air between them, recorded by the wire Mike wore, and transmitted to federal agents who were probably already moving through the building. Victoria stood slowly, her composure finally giving way to the anger she'd been holding back for 3 years. You destroyed my life, she said, her voice shaking with fury. You used my grief, my illness, my trust in family, to steal everything Marcus built. And then you convinced the world that I was the criminal. I saved the company. You stole from the company and framed me for the theft. Victoria's voice rose, echoing off the conference room walls. You manipulated a grieving, depressed woman into signing documents she couldn't understand, then used those signatures to steal $2 billion. Victoria, calm down. You're having another episode. I'm having a moment of clarity. Victoria stepped closer to Robert, and Mike saw in her face the strength that had built a technology empire alongside her husband. I remember everything. Robert, every conversation, every document, every time you told me I was too sick to understand what was happening. I remember, and now everyone else will too. The conference room door opened, and Agent Chen entered with two other federal agents, their weapons drawn but pointed at the floor. Robert Hayes, Agent Chen said formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement, fraud, and identity theft. Robert looked from the agents to Victoria to Mike, understanding finally flooding his face. You recorded this, he said to Victoria. We recorded it, Agent Chen corrected, gesturing to Mike. Mr. Thompson has been cooperating with our investigation. As the agents moved to handcuff Robert, he looked at Victoria with pure hatred. This won't end the way you think, he said. I have lawyers. Victoria, I have documentation. I have 3 years of evidence showing you're mentally unstable, and I have 3 years of evidence showing you're a thief and a liar, Victoria replied calmly. I think the jury will find that more compelling. As Robert was led away, still protesting his innocence and Victoria's incompetence, Agent Chen turned to Victoria. Ms. Hayes, you'll need to come with us as well. There are still charges pending, and we'll need your full cooperation in building the case against your brother-in-law. Victoria nodded, but she looked at Mike first. Thank you, she said simply, for believing me, for risking everything to help me fight back. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, Mike replied. As federal agents escorted Victoria from the building, Mike stood alone in the conference room, surrounded by photographs of Marcus Hayes and the legacy he'd built. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was beginning to wake up, and Mike realized that somewhere in the city, Emma was probably getting ready for school, unaware that her father had just helped solve one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in federal history. He also realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time since Sarah died, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than fear. 6 months later, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and photographers when Victoria Hayes emerged from her sentencing hearing, but Mike barely noticed them. He was focused on Victoria's face, on the relief and exhaustion, and something like peace that he saw there. How does it feel to be officially innocent? He asked as they walked toward his car, the same battered Honda Civic, though it was running much better these days thanks to the mechanic work he could finally afford. Surreal, Victoria said, settling into the passenger seat. I keep expecting someone to tell me it's a mistake, that the charges are being reinstated. Robert got 15 years, Mike reminded her. The evidence was overwhelming once the FBI knew what to look for. I know. It's just hard to believe it's really over. The trial had been a media sensation, the billionaire CEO who'd been framed by her own family, the federal fugitive who was actually the victim, the delivery driver who'd helped expose one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in recent history. Mike had testified about his conversations with both Victoria and Robert, his words helping to establish the timeline of manipulation and deception that had destroyed Victoria's life. What's the first thing you want to do? Mike asked as they drove through downtown Chicago. Now that you're free to be yourself again. Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching the city pass by the window. I want to have dinner with you and Emma, she said finally. A real dinner, in a real home, with people who know who I am and care about me anyway. That can be arranged. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the magnitude of what had ended and what was beginning. Victoria had regained control of Hayes Digital Solutions, though she'd decided to step back from day-to-day operations and focus on the innovation projects that had always been her passion. Mike's construction business was thriving, thanks in part to the publicity from the trial, but mostly because word had spread about the quality of his work and his integrity in dealing with clients. "Michael," Victoria said as they pulled into the parking lot of Emma's school, "there's something I want to ask you." "What's that one?" "Would you consider a partnership not romantic, though I hope we can explore that possibility eventually, but professional?" Hayes Digital Solutions needs someone to oversee the physical infrastructure expansion, and I need someone I can trust completely. Mike looked at her, seeing not the federal fugitive or the billionaire CEO, but the woman who'd made coffee in her kitchen and talked about loneliness and new beginnings. What would that look like? Co-managing partner, equal say in major decisions, salary that would let you stop worrying about Emma's tuition or your car repairs or whether you can afford to take a day off when you're sick. Victoria, that's incredibly generous, but it's not generosity. Michael, it's recognition. You saved my life, not just by helping me fight the charges, but by seeing me as a person worth saving when I'd almost forgotten that myself. Mike thought about it as they waited for Emma to emerge from the school building. A partnership with Victoria would mean financial security for his daughter, the chance to build something lasting, the opportunity to work with someone whose values aligned with his own, but it would also mean accepting help in a way that challenged his fierce independence. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course," though I should mention that Emma's already given her opinion on the matter. "She has. I asked her yesterday what she thought about the possibility of me working with her father. She said, and I quote, 'Dad needs someone smart to keep him from working himself to death, and you need someone good to help you remember how to smile.'" "Out of the mouths of babes," Mike laughed, seeing Emma emerge from the school building with her violin case and a grin that could light up the entire city. "Dad," she called, running toward the car. "Ms. Victoria, did you guys see the news they're calling Dad a hero?" "They're calling him a good man who stood up for what was right," Victoria corrected gently, "which is what heroes actually are." As Emma climbed into the back seat and began chattering about her day, Mike felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sarah died. Not just contentment or relief, but the sense that his life was moving towards something larger than mere survival. "Victoria," he said quietly, as Emma described her science project in enthusiastic detail, "I don't need to think about your offer. No, I'd be honored to be your partner. In whatever capacity feels right." Victoria smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile he'd seen from her since that night in the conference room when she decided to stop running and start fighting. "Good," she said, "because I have some ideas about home security systems that are going to revolutionize the industry. And I'm going to need someone to make sure the technology actually works in real homes with real families. I know just the consultant for that," Mike said, glancing in the rearview mirror at Emma, who was now explaining the molecular structure of water to her stuffed elephant. "Just one condition," Victoria added. "What's that?" "The first system we install has to be in your apartment. Emma deserves to live somewhere that feels as safe as she is loved." As they drove through Chicago toward home, toward the life they were building together, one conversation, one shared meal, one act of trust at a time, Mike realized that sometimes the most important deliveries weren't the ones you got paid for. Sometimes they were the ones that delivered you to exactly where you were meant to be. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and clean and full of possibility, covering the city in the promise of new beginnings. 6 months later, the rain still falls on Chicago, but it doesn't feel the same. Michael Thompson learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust a stranger, and sometimes it's the only thing that can save you. He risked everything: his daughter's safety, his freedom, his quiet life to stand up for a woman the whole world believed was a criminal. Victoria Hayes discovered that running from your past only works until someone believes in your future. She'd hidden behind false names and empty penthouses, convinced that loneliness was the price of survival. But love, it turns out, has a way of finding you in the most unexpected places. The FBI closed their case. Robert Hayes will spend the next 15 years in federal prison. Hayes Digital Solutions is building security systems that protect families instead of hiding them. And Emma Thompson finally has the mother she never asked for, but always needed. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the boardroom. It was in learning that sometimes the person who saves you isn't a hero. They're just someone brave enough to see you when the rest of the world has looked away. We all deliver something to the people we meet. The question is, what are you carrying? And who's brave enough to help you carry it?